Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speedcafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, Daniel Ricciardo is set to return to the grid for the first time in almost 2 months as Red Bull Racing despairs over Sergio Perez's ongoing form slump. The FIA has accepted Michael Andretti's 11th F1 bid, but the sport itself is lukewarm on the application, and Formula One gears up for what could be the biggest United States Grand Prix yet. My name's Michael Lamonato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company and the company of my co-host from Speedcafe. I won't ask him to do his best Texan accents, but he's free to try. It's Mat Coch.
I'll go with yeehaw. That's all you're getting out of me. Accents aren't a strong point given the fact that I've got a half English, half Australian accent.
Well, that's good. You've got two down. So at any given time, you're doing two different impressions. It's a very versatile accent on this show. 2.5 accents maybe we've got between us. Let's look, Matt, this weekend. Formula One is back after a 1-week break. Goodness, felt like a long 1-week break. But you won't feel like that by the end of it because we've got a triple header coming up. It's going to be a grueling set of races. Some races okay for the Australian time zone, others less so. So you may have to brace yourself towards the end when we get to Brazil. But this weekend it is the United States Grand Prix in Austin, Texas. Now in the category of long-running races, I suppose. We'll talk a little bit about the race in particular a little later on. But let's start first with Daniel Ricciardo, who's making his second comeback of 2023 this weekend, some 2 months after breaking his hand at the Dutch Grand Prix during practice in late August. The context of this comeback is a little bit different, though, isn't it? Because he's already signed the contract for next year, something he obviously didn't have when he came back before the mid-season break. So there's nothing specifically on the line for this season. Do you think that changes the comeback of the approach to his comeback this time around, Matt? Particularly given we've got a triple header, he'll need to, I guess, re-engage his race fitness after never really getting it going during the mid-season break.
Well, he's got over the most difficult one, hasn't he? I mean, Qatar's been done and dusted. So are a lot of the drivers after that one, to be fair. It's going to be an interesting little run home now. He's got 5 races before the end of the season. They're basically a free hit, really, aren't they? Because nothing's going to be expected of him. He's recovering from injury, so there's going to be that. There's getting back up to speed. There's the triple header, which is excellent timing for him to make the recovery and the return, because he's now got 3 weekends in a car. It's as good as almost testing was back in the day when, you know, drivers were banging around for 30 or 40,000 kilometers a year outside of a race weekend. Obviously, they can't do that anymore, and that's the challenge they face. So, I mean, what can we expect? It's a big question because we don't really know where that AlphaTauri is. The car's changed since Daniel drove it last. Yuki Tsunoda has been given a hurry up by Liam Lawson, so he's probably got the rocket under him as well. And you know, Daniel's still not really familiar with that team. Yeah, he's had 2 and a bit race weekends, and he was in Singapore with the team, but he's still going to be learning, you know, names and processes and those sorts of things. And then on top of that, he's got the nuance of getting the car in a hyper-competitive field where a tenth of a second can put you in or out of Q2 or Q3. This is a big job that's ahead of him now. It's not disastrous if he doesn't fire straight away because he's got next year locked away. This is pre-season testing almost, an extended pre-season testing session in many respects, because if he doesn't score points, well, that's kind of been the norm for AlphaTauri. So how is that any different to what's happened all year?
I think it is interesting, that comparison with Yuki Tsunoda. A lot of the things we're saying now applied when he came back the first time around for the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is that is his principal bar against which he's going to be measured. Tsunoda, as you say, he's had a variety of drivers now to be compared against this year, but most recently Liam Lawson, who, in those circumstances, as you said, the car changed during Liam Lawson's tenure, was improved, certainly, but Lawson, by the end of it, scored points. And Daniel's yet to score points. He only had 2 races, of course, but yet to score points. Yuki Tsunoda's scoring points only sporadically. Of course, that's been down to the car. But there is an interesting, different comparison going on here. And certainly Tsunoda knows that he's had to lift his game again this year. It will continue to be an interesting teammate battle, I think, and particularly in the context too. And we've heard various people at AlphaTauri say this over the last month, that Daniel really contributes to the team. Again, after only 2.5 Grand Prix, I suppose, in the mid-season break. they've been appreciative of the way he approaches the challenge of improving this car. We can't say the upgrades are down to Daniel because they're in the pipeline much longer, but his influence will certainly be felt over a longer period of time. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what effect this, as you sort of say, kind of like a free hit last 5 races will have on next year's car. Now, a lot of the parameters for next year's car are already locked in, but it being evolutionary, there's still a way for him to sort of influence that and give himself a little bit of an additional leg up for next year when, well, he will be out of contract, obviously enough, and the next chapter of his career will need to be planned out. Maybe that next chapter comes a little bit earlier than expected, because I guess in parallel with this, while there's nothing directly on the line for Ricciardo, there have been Sergio Perez's ongoing struggles. We've talked about him plenty this year, Sergio Perez, but Red Bull Racing's language has changed a little bit again after Qatar, maybe become a little bit more urgent. Perhaps having seen how close McLaren was to Max Verstappen at the end of that race, admittedly it was a little bit of a weird and unusual race, but you could say we saw pure race pace, if you like, because of the tyre stints we talked about last week. Thought it was interesting too that Helmut Marko suggested Sergio Perez might benefit from a change of team. That seems fairly explicit, even if it was in, as is the way with Helmut Marko, a media that was not English language speaking, as if someone wasn't going to find it and translate it. Where do we assess the risk factor here for Sergio in the context of a variety of AlphaTauri drivers now really pushing hard for promotion, given the way that lineup's changed? Is it any more real than we kind of concluded around the mid-season break?
The pressure on him is only ramped up throughout 2023. Sergio Perez has to improve if he's going to keep that drive. It's as simple as that. If he doesn't, as you say, you've got Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda waiting in the wings. Liam Lawson's also there, rubbing his hands together, waiting for a berth in F1. Sergio Perez has to improve, and if he doesn't, he needs to match what he was doing at the first 4 races of this year, where he was a match or close to for Max Verstappen. Since Miami and then Monaco on top of that, he hasn't been deserving in most events of a Red Bull drive. His performances haven't been good enough for a car that dominates Formula One. To put that in perspective, Red Bull would still be in charge of the Constructors' Championship without Sergio Perez. Now, that's this year, when Red Bull has a dominant car. Next year, that situation may change and probably will change as teams find ways to make progress and close that gap. So, while this year Red Bull can effectively survive with one car, who's to say that will happen next year? Just look at what's happening at Aston Martin, where Fernando Alonso is absolutely carrying that team. Lance Stroll has similar questions to answer to Sergio Perez, really, but what's holding Aston Martin back in the championship is Lance Stroll's contribution, or more to the point, a lack of contribution. They're in a fight for Constructors' Championship positions, which are worth a significant amount of money, and they're sort of fighting with one hand behind their back, much as Red Bull is. It's just the difference is Red Bull doesn't have a direct rival this year. So in 12 months' time, that's going to be more important. We know Sergio has a contract for 2024, and I can't see that changing no matter what Sergio does in the next 12 or 18-ish months. I think Sergio will be there until the end of next year, purely because he's not performing to the point where it's detrimental to the team. It's not costing the team money. I mean, it might in Constructors' Championship terms, but at the moment it's okay. The problem is Sergio brings finance with him, and he has the backing of Carlos Slim Domet, who, if you're going to break a contract, you probably don't want to break a contract with Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world. You know, can easily beat Red Bull in court in terms of spending power. So, not to say that he necessarily would, or that it would go that way, but why upset that apple cart if it doesn't really matter? That's, as we sit here today, in 12 months' time, Red Bull sitting third in the Constructors' Championship to Mercedes and McLaren, although Max Verstappen's dominating the Drivers' World Championship again. Suddenly, Perez's position is untenable. At the moment, it's very close to untenable. He has to improve if he's to retain that drive for 2025. And the problem is, if he doesn't improve in 2024, what do his prospects look like in 2025. Where's he going to go? There's a few seats on offer, but do you want a driver who has had a couple of lifelines thrown his way already and his head and his morale are on the floor? Because I think that's ultimately what it is. He hasn't forgotten how to drive. He's not a bad driver by any stretch of the imagination. He's a phenomenal driver, but he's a confidence driver. And at the moment, he doesn't have any confidence.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to sum it up. It would take a really astounding improvement in those confidence levels, or rather the ability to manage those confidence levels, I suppose, next year for me to see him staying there in 2025. At the moment, I don't think there's any chance of that. It is in his hands, of course. If next year he can be consistently, I know it doesn't sound very competitive, but consistently second to Max Verstappen, depending, of course, on how the team goes relative to the others, then maybe you could mount the argument that he's overcome that mental anguish of understanding he can't beat Max in a championship fight and settles for where he is, perhaps with the prospect of knowing that if he doesn't hold on to Red Bull, maybe retirement is the alternative and he's not ready for that. It's hard to know what he's thinking, of course. But with the likes of, Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson pushing up, it feels a little bit like we're back to the situation Red Bull used to be in, where there's enough upwards pressure that you can't scrape through on a seat anymore. And that is my concern for him in even partway through next year. I think he'll certainly start with the team next season, but at the moment he's had one podium since the mid-season break. Like, that's not really at Red Bull's level. I know we might want to say that Max Verstappen you can never truly outperform a car, but for want of a better phrase, getting absolutely everything out of it, and Perez is not. But it's not as if Perez is the natural level of the car at the moment. He is a little bit lower than that. I think that's a concern as well. The fact that he continues to say the car's been developed away from him, which in one sense is probably true, just in the way that it is becoming faster in a less predictable way that Max can handle and he can't. But the team sort of insists that it is confidence and that's up to him, not the team, to figure out. I thought that sort of, it's not necessarily a change in language, but a little bit more pointedly saying that was interesting in that context as well. And then, there's a sponsorship argument for Red Bull, but if there's one team that is not necessarily needing the money, I think Red Bull Racing might be that. So I think there's an interesting additional context there, an interesting additional battle there. And we can't forget as well that Sergio Perez is only 30 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton in the Drivers' Championship and got lucky in Qatar that Lewis Hamilton wiped himself out of the first lap, because otherwise surely would have made, at least 10 points probably on him, and suddenly we'd be talking about this being a much closer battle for second. And I think it's just difficult to justify in a car this good not finishing second in the Drivers' Championship. So that's its own spin on the way this could go. If we get to the end of the year and he can't secure second, is that recoverable in the long term for him? Hard to say. It's something Red Bull Racing's never done and may not get the chance to do next year. Just finally on Daniel Ricciardo, though, before we move on, you mentioned there AlphaTauri has made upgrades. It has improved. It's got its best result in Singapore at the hands of Liam Lawson of the year, of course, with a couple of points there. Do you think that changes I know we've already talked about the approach, but I guess the targets for the end of the year for this team? We've got an interesting kind of close battle at the bottom of the constructor standings. Do you think his comeback changes that target for where they might be aiming to finish?
I don't think they can really put a target on it beyond just going out there and trying to learn for next year. That should be their focus. This year's already got away from them. I don't have the constructors' points ahead of me right now, but they're at the foot of the table and they're likely to remain there. They might get to ninth. I don't remember what the gap is. But best case scenario, they're ninth, which is not a significant jump in money. We're talking about $3 or $4 million, which in the context of AlphaTauri probably doesn't matter. But therefore be better almost using these next 5 races as development and learning for next year and get a little bit of a head start in terms of the real world application. Because one of the biggest things in Formula One, and a word that we always hear, is correlation. And what that means is it's not just the real world performance that teams consider. They've got CFD, computational fluid dynamics. They've got the aerodynamics, the wind tunnel, all those things feeding together, and they need all of those pieces of information to be saying the same thing. If one of them doesn't, that's when you start to get correlation issues, because you start to either trust data that isn't trustworthy, or you begin to mistrust data that perhaps is trustworthy. So having that correlation is critical. And so having 5 races where you can really nail that down and get it absolutely bang on for the start of 2024, that's a good thing. And if you can start now thinking about 24, the sacrifice of some 23 performance, start looking at front wings, bits that can carry over into next year's car, you can give yourself a little bit of a head start. Now, obviously, there's some lead time in that, and production times, it may not work, but they need to understand all the data that they've currently got. They need to get Daniel really embedded in that team. This is now, I sort of said it before, which is this is pre-season for AlphaTauri, so that when they get to Bahrain in the days ahead of next year's championship, they can come out the gates and go bang with something that's a step forward from where they are now. We know that they're not going to be called AlphaTauri next year, but that's another matter. But I don't think we can sit there and say, yeah, they need to be finishing 10th, they need to be finishing 12th. I don't think those targets really apply. They need to be going out there and getting laps, finishing races, banking data, getting Daniel comfortable, milking Daniel for everything he's worth, because here's a guy who's won 8 Grand Prix. AlphaTauri is a team that is historically, going way back to the Minardi days, is a team that hasn't typically had experienced drivers. It's a breeding ground for young drivers for Red Bull since Dietrich Mateschitz bought it. And as a result, it hasn't had that leadership from within the cockpit, the ability to read a race, to dictate strategy and setup and direction in terms of development the way that Daniel Ricciardo can. So there's a value to be extracted out of Daniel there. That's why they've got him in the car over Liam Lawson. Fundamentally, that is the biggest thing, his experience. They want to push that team forward from last, so they want to leverage that out of Daniel. They need to get him absolutely bedded down, get the data bedded down, and then they're in a really good position for 6 months' time when we start this whole circus up again.
Let's change tack a little bit now. This weekend, the United States Grand Prix, and funnily enough, Formula One, I guess, has been preparing for this for a couple of weeks with the bid from Michael Andretti. Andretti Formula Racing wants to be the 11th team in Formula One. It is, I wouldn't say quite an all-American entry bid, but it's as close as we're going to get, I suppose. That's the way they've been approaching it. They want American drivers in the team. They want almost entirely to be based in the United States, acknowledging, though, that having a European base is always a little bit more useful. We didn't get a chance to talk about this last week, obviously, in the aftermath of the Qatar Grand Prix, but the FIA has approved that 11th bid. That isn't the green light, however. It's now up to Formula One itself to negotiate commercial terms and decide that the team brings sufficient value to be allowed into the sport. There's a little bit of conjecture about how necessary that step is. We'll talk about the FIA president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, a little bit later on, but he insists that it's not required, but it would probably be pretty messy if it is not granted from Stefano Domenicali and his business. They haven't said too much so far. The statement from them, from Formula One, has been pretty brief, just that they're going to have a look at it. The teams have been far less brief. They're mostly very against it, depending on who you ask. It's a little bit messy, I think it's fair to say. It is not the clean entry process Michael Andretti probably would have wanted, although he's certainly forecast as much. Why is it so messy, Matt? We know there's a little bit of tension between F1 and the FIA. We know the teams don't want to risk losing any money in this boom time for Formula One. But are you surprised that a name like Andretti is having so much trouble entering the sport?
Formula One and the Formula One paddock is known as the Piranha Club for a reason, because it's, to mix metaphors, it's dog eat dog in there. Really. It is. Dog eat fish.
Dog eat dog, fish
eat fish. Yeah, whatever. But there is a massive amount of self-interest in Formula One. It's hyper competitive, and that extends not only to, winning pole position or breaking the latest or being first the apex or whatever. It extends to the boardroom and to the accountants and every aspect of every one of these teams. They're all hyper competitive individuals. If you're not, you just get eaten up in Formula One. It is a brutal business. If you're not first, you're last. It's that simple. So teams are talking about finances, needing to add value because they don't want to lose whatever part of whatever pie they've currently got. Now, Formula One teams earn a significant amount of money through prize money. It's one of their biggest sources of income, in fact. Last week I ran an analysis on Speedcafe of the prize money that's set to be paid out to teams this year in 2023. Now, 2023 prize money is paid out based on the 2022 championship standings, but using the income that Formula One earns this year, or the forecast revenue income for this year. We're approaching the quarter three financial results being published, so we'll get a little bit more accurate in a few weeks' time. But roughly at this point, we can say that Red Bull is looking at $87.6 million in prize money. That's big money. No matter which way you carve it up, that's big money. Ferrari in second from the championship last year, they don't get 142 because it gets some bonuses. But there's a couple of different ways. And again, there's an article on Speedcafe that you can go and get the full details. But Williams in 10th last year earned $59.6 million. Now, that's because the prize money pot is split 10 ways. So they get effectively a tenth of it. And then there's a sliding scale that they also get access to, which gives them another pot of money. If an 11th team comes in, be that Andretti or anyone else, that pot has to be divided up a little bit more. The sliding scale changes, but the teams are out there saying that this is going to cost us tens of millions of dollars, which, I'm sorry, I've crunched the numbers, it's garbage. They're massively overestimating the impact that Andretti will have financially on them. Ultimately, adjusting the sliding scale, which you would have to do to make the numbers work, Williams got 59.6 million, or hypothetically will get 59.6 million this year. If Andretti was on the grid, Williams will get $58.6 million this year, a $1.02 million drop. That's not the $10 million that some teams are suggesting. Now, at the sharp end of town, then there is a more significant impact. Red Bull will be down to 78 million from, was it 87 or 88 million dollars? So there is an impact, but it's scaling towards the front of the grid, the teams that can most afford it. There's also the anti-dilution fund that needs to be taken into account. That's $20 million per team, a one-time payment. If Williams is losing $1 million this year and receiving a $20 million bonus, well, it's $19 million to the good. If it continued to finish 10th going forward, it would take 19 years for it to break even. So Formula One has a little bit of time here. Now, obviously, that period is much reduced for Red Bull and those at the top end of town, where it's proportionally more significant to their prize money income. But it still affords Formula One time to build its business, to grow the sport, to capitalize on Andretti, and bring in that prize money to offset the addition of 11th team. So the anti-dilution fund is absolutely doing what it needs to do. Even if you jack it up to 600 million, like has been suggested, all that does is buy you more time and minimize the impact again. So I know that's the point of it, but what we're being sold isn't what we're being told isn't actually what's being sold. The other argument that's being made is that there's only a limited pool of advertisers out there, that companies willing to sponsor Formula One. A marketing director I know from many years ago said that the Formula One doesn't sell sponsorship. Formula One doesn't go out there looking for companies that want to advertise in Formula One. They go out there looking for CEOs who want a weekend at a Formula One track and be able to tell their mates that they can get all this access into Formula One. That's what it's all about. They're selling an experience. Obviously, that's changed a little bit in recent years, and there is a little bit more value on the exposure side of things because it is more valuable, but there's plenty of companies out there that we've never heard of that, as Formula One grows, will want to come in. I mean, case in point, Aston Martin is in the process of dropping Cognizant from its name because Cognizant doesn't need the exposure anymore because it's had its money's worth. I didn't know who Cognizant was 5 years ago. I do know now. Job done. So how many other companies are there out there like that? Also, the more the sport grows with the cost cap and the financial regulations, the less sponsorship teams actually need. So a growing sport is healthy. Now, obviously, there's an economic principle, which is when the going's good, you save, because that way when the going's bad, you've got that surplus of funds. So they do need to ring fence things a little bit and be careful. So you don't want to let in charlatan teams like used to litter the back end of the Formula One grid. You want established players. Andretti ticks that box. You want big name companies involved. General Motors and Cadillac tick that box. Teams that can develop a car that's worthy of a Formula One grid. Andretti ticks that box. They've got the facilities there, they've got the staff there, they've got the pedigree, they've got the name, they've got the marketing ability. I don't see a reason why Formula One shouldn't be jumping up and down saying, hey, look, we've got the biggest name in American motorsport and selling that to the world's biggest economy, because there's so much opportunity out there for Formula One to grow in the United States. It's still not a big sport over there. For everything that we're told in Drive to Survive and Netflix and all that, we're still not a big sport in the United States. A little bit of growth in that market is going to be massive. How many more companies can we bring in? I don't think the arguments that are being presented by those within the paddock I don't think they hold water. I think Andretti should be on the grid. It's that simple.
Fine line, an important distinction between charlatan teams and teams based in Charlotte, North Carolina.
No, I was definitely not referring to Haas.
No, it's just a joke. Relax. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it was old mate Dave Dicker from Rodent, who was one of the rejected teams, who said recently a lot of the financial arguments don't make sense when you think about them. All the new team would have to bring was approximately $90 million in value, and that would be enough to cap off comfortably the prize money that they'd be owed. These talks of $600 million, we're talking in US dollars here, to be clear, on an Australian podcast, maybe I should be clear, but so that's approximately 100 billion Australian dollars, I suppose. But all they have to bring in is enough to cover their prize money, essentially. And it would be difficult to argue, you would think, that an entry like Andretti, along with General Motors, and of course it's a little bit up in the air how much they're contributing, but they're at least sponsoring the team and possibly some kind of technical partnership involved, that couldn't eventually amount to that amount of prize money or that amount of value. All they have to do essentially is not embarrass themselves at the back, look like they're growing and moving forward, and that sort of sounds like motorsport to me. But we'll wait and see how that pans out, because the background of this is, in fact, a much bigger political fight between the FIA and Formula One. There's been a lot of needle between the two administrations in recent years, essentially since President Mohammed Ben Sulayem came to power at the start of 2022, the start of last year, taking over from Jean Todt. Runs things in a little bit of a different way to Jean Todt, I think it's fair to say. Had a fairly high profile last year, announced earlier this year that he'd be stepping back a little bit from Formula One to focus on the FIA's other motorsport properties, and also perhaps in recognition that he'd been causing a little bit of controversy, got a big slap down from Formula One itself for meddling in commercial matters. But more recently, he's back. He's been making a lot of comments. Not back, he never went anywhere, but he's certainly been making a lot of significant pronouncements, one of which has been to unilaterally, this was earlier in the year, obviously, open up the bidding process for a new team, which is in the FIA's prerogative, but certainly F1 and the teams weren't that happy about it. Subsequently accepted one team. I guess that's better than two from F1's perspective, but nonetheless accepted one, has put the ball in F1's court. More recently has said there's no reason for Formula One not to accept the Andretti bid, so putting a little bit of pressure there and turning the screws, and then subsequently said F1 should have more teams and fewer races, which certainly seems to, let's say, intrude on commercial matters for Formula One. Regardless of that matter, I suppose, it's certainly a big policy statement, I suppose, from a man who is keen to emphasise, and I think these are his words, is the landlord of Formula One, not simply like a silent partner. F1 is the tenant. That is how it kind of works. Are you surprised how much he's waded into this matter, considering how controversial it's already become? Or is this just a sign of things to come, do you think?
You're right in that there is an underlying scrabble for power in Formula One. It's the proverbial church and state argument, really. The FIA owns the property that is Formula One. It sets the technical regulations. It's its ball game. It then just goes to sell the commercial rights to that under EU law. It has to. That originally went to Bernie Ecclestone. He then on-sold that. But that's just the commercial rights that Liberty Media now owns. Hypothetically, that's doing things like marketing the championship, making sure that the competitors are there, making sure that it looks right, making sure that it's providing value to sponsors. It's Liberty Media's involvement shouldn't extend to the technical side of things, because that's when you start to get a blurring of the line in terms of, think of Australian Formula 4, for instance, you had Motorsport Australia as the regulator, but then you had Motorsport Australia as the promoter. It's a conflict of interest. You've got to have that separation. So Liberty Media can't dabble in the technical side of things because it could then, hypothetically influence the outcome of a championship that it has a commercial interest in. So there's got to be that separation. Now, obviously, Liberty Media has an interest in what that looks like because the technical side of things influences the product that it has to sell. So it needs to make sure it's got a saleable product, but there needs to be governance around the way those conversations happen. And that's the point that has been blurred a little bit in the last probably 5 or 10 years with all the working groups and all those sorts of things that have been set up. There's been greater influence from Formula One itself, particularly in the 2023 regulation or the 2022 regulations that were introduced. They largely came out of Formula One and then the FIA agreeing to them under Jean Tot's leadership. Under the current regime, that system's been scrapped, and the team that was at Formula One has actually come into the FIA. So there's this really clear distinction between, again, church and state, so to speak, and it just doesn't sit really well with a few people. It's obviously jarring to Liberty Media because they came in and they had a train set that was all theirs to begin with, and now they're having to share or even pass up control in some respects to the FIA. Where does this start and finish? And I think everyone's now just sort of digging their trenches and firing a few salvos just to set out what that battleground looks like. And the Andretti thing is just a little pawn in that broader game, in my opinion.
Yeah, it was put to me, if you really wanted to make a point, you would of course accept an American team because which team is likely to be the most litigious? It's probably going to be an American team. So if something goes wrong, this is sure not to just end with a simple no from Formula One, particularly having got the green light from the FIA, which, as you say, regulates, technically, or in a sense, or in a logical sense, I suppose, Andretti is the 11th team or the 11th entry. It's just a matter of money now. But there's no, like you say, obvious, clear delineation anymore. They have to work hand in hand. That's just kind of how it has to be efficiently done. No one's saying that there absolutely needs to be a wall built between them. But it is a little bit complicated, particularly now that Formula One is so big and everyone seems to want a little bit of the action, I suppose. It's going to be harder than ever to try and delineate that. But let's look at the American Grand Prix proper now, Matt, to wrap this one up. Was last year the biggest race of the year in terms of attendance, 440,000 people. This year, Melbourne topped that with an extra 4,000 people, admittedly over 4 days as opposed to 3. The biggest crowd in the history of Formula One was in Adelaide, 520,000 people. That was also over 4 days. It's not easy to compare numbers, is my point. But suffice to say, Austin's a pretty popular event. Last year, they were talking about this year's race potentially cracking the 500,000 mark. That's been a little bit, I don't necessarily say want to water it down to become less of a focus because so much of attention in Formula One now is about creating the atmosphere, I suppose, and creating the vibe of the place, making sure the experience is very good. So that'll certainly be a focus for organisers now. But there's also this element of Austin, which is, weird though it is to say, it's not that old. It's only around about a decade, a little bit more. The long-running American race feels very much like the home of racing in the United States for Formula One, but being up against Miami in the same country and soon Las Vegas in the same country and a pair of other races in North America and Canada and Mexico City, which is next week, plus Brazil and South America. What is the position of this race, do you think? Is it at risk of becoming collateral to an overexpansion? We're probably a little bit far away from that point. It's certainly still booming in the United States, judging by crowd figures. But is it at risk of being, I guess, the plain old racing circuit when you've got significantly more glitzy events on either side of it?
It does feel a little bit like a traditional race weekend, doesn't it? In that you don't have some of the pomp and ceremony that goes around events like Monaco, and I'm sure Las Vegas will have. Miami has a very different feel to it again, and that's very deliberate. They want 3 different experiences catering to different markets in, as I said before, the world's largest economy. Austin is also not a million miles away from the Mexican border, so it can attract a lot of Mexican fans, particularly for Sergio Perez, another reason for Red Bull to hang on to him. and it gets huge patronage for that as well. So you're right in that it doesn't have the same oomph, so to speak, the same, I don't know what you call it, but whatever it is that Monaco has, Austin doesn't have that. But what it does have is this big festival feel. And that's something that Miami doesn't have. That's something that Las Vegas doesn't have. And that's what makes it unique. You know, they'll put concerts on there at night. It's very similar in many respects to the way the Australian Grand Prix is put on, where you've got a motor race, but that's just part of the experience of going to the venue. There's other things to see and do, where at some of the other venues, Qatar, for instance, if you weren't there for Formula One, well, why were you there? Because there was nothing else. Austin doesn't have that. It's a city that has embraced Formula One. I think Austin's tagline is something about being weird, and it really does bring that forward. Yeah, you see it all through the town in Austin. It's a city a little bit like Adelaide as well in that respect. You know, you mentioned that Adelaide had, what was it, 295,000 in 1995. I think Daniel Ricciardo was there that year, so it was 294,999 without Daniel. You know, that was a city that stopped and embraced Formula One. The whole city stopped and turned into a massive street party. It was fabulous. I mean, I grew up in Adelaide. I remember it very fondly, and probably through rose-tinted glasses. But Austin's sort of similar to Adelaide in many respects in that it's not a massive American city, and therefore Formula One comes in and it dominates. It's not like Melbourne. It's a little bit smaller than Melbourne, where Melbourne, it's an event happening in Melbourne. The Grand Prix doesn't take over the city in the way that it did in Adelaide, and you get that same feeling in Austin. So I think the US Grand Prix, yes, it's different to Las Vegas, and it's different to Miami, but it's different in a good way, and it's different in a way that adds value, and just feels like, perhaps the best term is family friendly. It feels family friendly. Where I mean, Las Vegas isn't. That's not going to be family friendly.
You don't think a race at 10 p.m. and qualifying at midnight family friendly, man?
On the strip in the city of sin, going to go with no. And Miami as well. That just seems like it doesn't have the same feel. It's more like a cocktail party than than a family barbecue, and that's what Austin has. It's got that family barbecue feel to it.
Yeah, it is such a cool city as well to host the race. I'm yet to, Las Vegas hasn't happened yet, and I'm yet to go to Miami, but Austin is one of the great, I think, attending races. I think it is one of the great races to have on a bucket list of F1 Grand Prix around the world. I mean, there are a great many that would be on that list, but if you're looking at the Americas, Austin and certainly Mexico City as well, and how fortunate that we get to look forward to both of those in the next couple of weeks. That's all the time we have for Pit Talk this week, though. We will be back next Monday or Tuesday to wrap up the United States Grand Prix. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and you can watch the video podcast on YouTube. Just search for Fox Sports Australia, and you can follow updates all this weekend at foxsports.com.au and speedcafe.com. From Mat Coch and me, Michael Lamonato, we'll catch you next week.